No one believed the dog. Not the worn-out family sitting in the pews. Not the neighbors who came out of obligation more than hope. Not even the funeral director who had followed the paperwork exactly as the county required. Everyone believed the same thing, that the man inside the coffin was gone, and the golden retriever at the back of the church was simply grieving. The old wooden church stood on the edge of town, its white paint cracked from decades of coal dust and winter storms. Outside, gray clouds pressed low against the hills of West Virginia, and a thin mix of sleet and rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, damp coats, and lilies that had been bought on credit. Daniel Brooks lay inside the closed coffin at the front of the room. 42 years old, an electrician by trade, a man who had spent his life fixing other people's problems while barely holding his own together. No health insurance, no savings, just calloused hands and a body that had finally given out on a job site no one would remember. Emily Brooks sat stiffly in the front row, her black coat pulled tight around her thin frame. Her eyes were red, not from fresh tears, but from days without real sleep. She stared straight ahead, afraid that if she looked at the coffin too long, something inside her would break for good. Bills waited at home. The mortgage notice was already overdue. Grief, for her, had no space to be dramatic. Behind her, time 200 stone. Daniel's father, Frank Brooks, sat with his hands clenched between his knees. A retired miner, raised to believe that death was final, and complaining didn't change it. He trusted paperwork. He trusted doctors. And he trusted that when the county signed a death certificate, the story was over. At the very back of the church, Max sat alone. The golden retriever was older now, his muzzle dusted with gray, his movements slower than they used to be. He had followed Daniel everywhere for nearly 10 years, through layoffs, long night shifts, and mornings when there was barely enough coffee to go around. Now he sat perfectly still, eyes locked on the coffin, as if the rest of the room had faded out of existence. People noticed him only in passing. "Poor dog," someone whispered. "They always know," another murmured, shaking their head. Max did not whine. He did not pace. His tail did not move. He simply watched. The pastor spoke gently about hard lives and quiet goodness, about a man who worked with his hands and loved his family. The words drifted through the room like smoke, settling without weight. Heads nodded. No one questioned anything. The service moved forward, just as it was supposed to. The funeral director glanced at his watch. Time mattered. Schedules mattered, especially for families who couldn't afford delays. That was when Max stood up. At first, no one noticed. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. The wind rattled the windows again. Then a low bark cut through the quiet. Not loud, not angry, just steady, intentional. A few heads turned. Emily looked back over her shoulder, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He's just not used to this." Max barked again. Not grief, not confusion, something closer to insistence. Frank shifted in his seat. "Someone take the dog outside," he muttered. "This isn't the time." A neighbor stood, hesitating, unsure whether to touch him. Max didn't look away from the coffin. His body was tense now, muscles tight beneath his fur, as if every instinct inside him had gone on alert. The barking continued, slow, rhythmic, unwilling to stop. The pastor paused mid-sentence. Silence spread through the church, thicker than before. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't loud enough to be disruptive, but it was impossible to ignore. Emily's hands trembled in her lap. She swallowed hard and whispered, almost to herself, "Max, please." The dog did not move. He took one step forward, then another, eyes fixed on the coffin as if something inside it mattered more than the rules of the room, more than grief, more than what everyone else had already accepted. And still, no one believed him. They believed the forms. They believed the signatures. They believed the world made sense. As Max's barking echoed softly against the church walls, something unseen and unfinished waited beneath the lid of that coffin. As Max's barking faded into the rafters, the church remained frozen in an awkward stillness. The sound hadn't been loud enough to cause a scene, yet it lingered, pressing against everyone's nerves like a question no one wanted to answer. The pastor cleared his throat, gently closing his Bible as if that alone might restore order. Emily rose from the front pew, her movements slow, careful, like someone afraid a sudden step might shatter what little balance she had left. She turned toward the back of the church, forcing a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice thin. "He's never been alone like this. He doesn't understand." A few people nodded in sympathy. In a town like this, folks knew dogs. They knew loyalty. They knew loss. What they didn't know, or didn't want to consider, was the possibility that grief didn't explain everything. Max barked once more, sharper this time. Not panicked, not mournful. It carried an edge that made a woman near the aisle flinch. The sound didn't ask for comfort. It demanded attention. Emily walked down the narrow aisle toward him, her shoes tapping softly against the worn wooden floor. She crouched beside Max and rested a hand on his head. His fur was warm beneath her fingers, his body rigid. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "Daddy's at peace now." At the word peace, Max let out a low whine, almost a growl, and pulled his head slightly away from her touch. His eyes never left the front of the church. Emily frowned. Max had always been gentle with her, always leaning into her hand when she needed grounding. This was different. His breathing was shallow, fast, like he'd been running. Behind her, Frank let out a tired sigh. "Emily," he said, louder than necessary, "let's not drag this out. People have places to be." She hesitated, torn between embarrassment and something she couldn't quite name. The last few weeks had taught her how quickly doubt could feel like hope, and how dangerous that could be. Daniel had collapsed at work. The ambulance had come too late. That's what they'd told her. That's what the doctor had signed. She tugged gently on Max's collar. "Come on," she murmured. "Let's step outside." Max didn't budge. Instead, he barked again. 3 short bursts, time 300 dims, that echoed off the walls. Heads turned sharply now. The funeral director shifted near the side door, his expression tightening. He had seen grief take many forms, but this was edging toward disruption. "That dog's upset," someone whispered. "Sounds like he's trying to say something," another replied under their breath. Emily swallowed. Her chest felt tight, like she was breathing through fabric. "Max," she pleaded quietly, "please." For the first time, Max looked at her. His eyes were wide, alert, not glassy with confusion, not dulled by sorrow. There was something urgent there, something that made her heart skip in a way she didn't want to acknowledge. He turned his head briefly toward the coffin, then back to her, as if asking her to follow. Emily froze. A memory flashed through her mind. Daniel teaching Max to nudge the door when someone knocked, training him to alert, to respond, to insist. "He's smart," Daniel had always said. "Smarter than most people I know." She shook the thought away. This wasn't the time. This wasn't the place. Frank stood up abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "That's enough," he snapped. "Time 7 hums. He's just a dog." The words landed harder than he intended. Emily flinched. Max growled low in his throat. Not at Frank, not in anger, but in warning. The sound rippled through the room, tightening the air. A neighbor stepped back instinctively. "This isn't right," someone muttered. The pastor raised a calming hand. "Let's all take a breath," he said gently. "We're here to say goodbye." Goodbye. The words seemed to settle over Max like a challenge. His barking resumed, steady and relentless now, filling the church with a rhythm that refused to fade. It wasn't chaos. It was insistence. Emily straightened slowly, her hand still resting on Max's neck. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "He's never acted like this before." No one responded right away. They all heard it now. The difference. This wasn't a dog lost in grief. This was a dog who wouldn't accept an ending. And as Max's gaze locked once more on the coffin, something inside Emily began to crack. Not with hope, but with fear. A quiet, unsettling fear that maybe, just maybe, goodbye had come too soon. The barking wore people down faster than grief ever could. It wasn't loud enough to feel dangerous, but it pressed on the room like a slow ache, steady, unavoidable. The kind of sound that settled into your chest and refused to leave. A few mourners shifted in their seats. One woman glanced toward the exit, calculating how rude it would be to slip out early. Frank Brooks stood stiffly, his jaw tight. Years underground had taught him to trust rules, schedules, and hard conclusions. You learned quickly in the mines that hesitation got people killed. When a foreman said it was time to move, you moved. When the doctor said someone was gone, you accepted it. Dragging things out only made the pain worse. "Emily," he said again, this time softer, but edged with exhaustion. We've done everything we can. The doctor signed off. The county cleared it. We can't keep second-guessing this. Emily didn't answer right away. Her hand rested on Max's collar, fingers curled tightly into the worn leather. She could feel his pulse through the fur, fast, urgent, alive, too alive. Rate slow. I know, she said finally. He's never like this. Frank exhaled sharply. Dogs pick up on emotions, he said. He's feeding off yours. That stung, because part of her wondered if he was right. She hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. Her body felt hollowed out, like grief had scraped her clean and left nothing solid behind. Bills covered the kitchen table at home. Hospital invoices, towing fees, notices stamped final. The funeral itself was paid for with borrowed money and favors she would spend years repaying. There was no room for doubt. Doubt was expensive. The funeral director stepped closer, his voice low and professional. Mrs. Brooks, if you'd like, we can take the dog outside for a moment, just until we finish. Max barked again, sharper now, as if he understood every word. Emily shook her head. He won't bite. I'm sure, the man replied, though his eyes flicked toward Max's rigid posture. But people are getting uncomfortable. That word echoed through her mind. Daniel had lived his whole life making other people comfortable, fixing wiring after hours, taking under-the-table jobs, keeping his head down so no one would notice how close they were to losing everything. Now, even in death, he was expected not to inconvenience anyone. Frank reached down and grabbed Max by the collar. Come on, he muttered. Let's go. The moment Frank tugged, Max resisted with surprising strength. His paws slid slightly against the floor, nails scraping wood. A low sound rose from his chest, not a growl aimed at a person, but something raw, protective. Dad, Emily snapped, sharper than she intended. Don't. Frank froze. He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time she saw something crack in his certainty. His hands trembled slightly. We can't do this, he said quietly. I watched men die in caves, Emily. When it's over, it's over. You don't come back from that. Rate. Max lunged forward then, not at Frank, not at anyone, but toward the coffin. His body planted itself between the first pew and the front aisle, broad and unmoving, as if he'd been trained for this exact moment. A murmur swept through the room. What's he doing? He's guarding it. That don't seem right. Emily's heart began to pound. She stood, stepping closer despite herself. Max's body blocked her path to the coffin, but his head turned toward her again, eyes locked onto hers with a focus that made her breath hitch. He barked once, short, forceful. Then again. Each sound landed like a knock inside her chest. Frank shook his head, rubbing his face. This is ridiculous, he muttered. But his voice lacked conviction now. We're tired. Everyone's tired. That's all this is. The pastor hesitated at the pulpit, unsure whether to continue or step aside. The carefully planned order of the service had unraveled, replaced by something messier, something human. Emily swallowed hard. "What if we're wrong?" she asked. "Time 400 mums," her voice barely audible. Frank stared at her. "About what?" She didn't answer. Max's barking changed then. Not louder, but faster, urgent. Each sound closer together, like time itself was running out. He took one step forward, then another, placing himself directly in front of the coffin. The air in the church felt suddenly heavy, as if the walls were pressing inward. "That don't sound like mourning," someone whispered. Frank's face drained of color. Max stood perfectly still now, tail rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed on the wood inches away from him. His breathing slowed, controlled, deliberate, like he was listening for something no one else could hear. Emily felt her knees weaken. A cold fear crept up her spine, sharp and unwelcome. "Max?" she whispered. The dog didn't respond. He lowered his head slowly and pressed his ear against the lid of the coffin. And in that moment, the weariness of the living gave way to something far more terrifying. The possibility that they had all been wrong. The moment Max pressed his ear to the coffin, the church seemed to shrink around him. The barking stopped. Not gradually, not uncertainly, but all at once, as if someone had cut the sound from the room. That silence hit harder than the noise ever had. People leaned forward without realizing it. Breath held. Eyes fixed on the dog now crouched beside the casket. Max didn't move. He didn't blink. He listened. Emily felt a cold wave roll through her stomach. The air smelled suddenly sharper. Polish from the wooden pews, lilies wilting under heat, damp wool coats thawing too fast. Her heart thudded so loudly she wondered if others could hear it. "Max?" she whispered. No response. Frank took a step forward, then stopped. He had seen silence before, the kind that followed a collapse in a mine shaft, when radios went quiet and men stared at each other, already knowing the truth. This silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was loaded. A man near the aisle cleared his throat. "What's he doing now?" No one answered. Max shifted slightly, adjusting his ear against the lid, as if fine-tuning a signal. His tail, once rigid, lowered just a bit. His breathing slowed, measured, intentional. This wasn't panic. This was focus. Emily took another step toward the coffin, her legs unsteady. "He's listening," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Frank frowned. Listening for what? She didn't know. She only knew that Max had acted like this once before, years ago when a faulty line sparked behind their kitchen wall. He'd barked, paced, refused to settle until Daniel cut the power and tore into the drywall. They'd found scorched wires inches from a fire. Daniel had laughed then. "Good dog," he'd said. "Saved us a fortune in home insurance." The memory tightened her chest. Max lifted his head slightly and let out a low sound. Not a bark, not a whine. Something between the two. A signal. Then he nudged the coffin with his nose, gently at first, almost respectfully. A woman near the front gasped. "Did you see that?" "He's touching it," someone murmured. The funeral director stepped forward, his professional calm cracking. "Ma'am, this really isn't—" Max nudged the coffin again, harder this time. The wood made a dull sound, soft but unmistakable. Emily's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her mouth, afraid of what might come out if she didn't. Her eyes burned, not with tears, but with fear she hadn't allowed herself to feel yet. "Stop," Frank said automatically, though his voice lacked force. "This isn't right." Max ignored him. He placed both front paws against the side of the coffin, steadying himself. His ears flicked, his head tilted. Then he froze. Every muscle in his body went still, as if something had reached back. Emily felt it then. A sensation so faint she almost dismissed it. A vibration under her feet, like the low rumble of a truck passing far away. She shook her head, telling herself it was nerves. Max made a sound again, short, sharp, not loud enough to echo, but strong enough to cut through the hush. Emily stepped closer without asking permission. She rested her palm against the smooth wood. At first, there was nothing. Then, barely there, a tremor. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "I felt something," she said, her voice trembling. Frank's face hardened, more out of fear than disbelief. "Emily, you're exhausted," he said. "You want there to be something." "I know what I felt," she snapped, surprising both of them. A murmur rippled through the church now, no longer whispers, but fragmented sentences overlapping each other. "Did anyone else? That dog ain't acting normal. Maybe we should check." The funeral director wiped his brow, suddenly unsure of his authority. "We can't just... There are procedures." Max barked again. It was different from before. Lower, more urgent. Each bark landed with purpose, like a countdown. Emily turned to the director, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please," she said, "just listen to him." Frank stared at the coffin, his certainty unraveling thread by thread. The rules he had clung to felt thin now, brittle. He took a step forward and placed his hand against the wood. He held it there. His eyes widened. "Frank?" Emily whispered. He swallowed hard. "I don't know," he said. "But something's wrong." Max backed away one step, giving them space. His eyes locked on the lid. He didn't bark again. He didn't need to. The change had already happened. This was no longer about grief, no longer about manners or schedules or paperwork. It was about time, and whether they had already lost too much of it. What would you do in this moment? Trust the paperwork, trust your instincts, or trust the dog? Comment 1, 2, or 3 now. Max moved first. Not with panic, not with confusion. He stepped back from the coffin, turned once, then deliberately placed himself directly in front of it. Broad chest squared, legs planted, head low. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't snarl. He simply stood there, unmoving, as if the space between him and the coffin belonged to him alone. The message was unmistakable. A ripple of unease passed through the church. "That dog's guarding it," a man whispered from the third pew. Emily felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She had seen Max protect things before. Daniel's work boots, the front door at night, their old pickup when strangers lingered too long. But never like this. This wasn't territorial. This was intentional, purposeful. The funeral director took an uncertain step forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to remove the dog," he said, though his voice lacked conviction now. Years of handling grief hadn't prepared him for this kind of disruption. Quiet, focused, impossible to dismiss. Frank stepped beside Emily, his shoulders tense. "Max," he said firmly, "move." Max didn't even look at him. Frank reached out, fingers brushing the thick fur at Max's collar. The moment he applied pressure, Max reacted. Not by snapping, but by stiffening completely. A low sound vibrated in his chest, deep, steady, vibrating up through the wood floor and into the air. A warning. Frank's hand froze mid-motion. "Dad," Emily said quietly, fear threading her voice. "Don't." Frank pulled his hand back slowly. His mouth opened, then closed again. He had faced cave-ins, machinery failures, explosions underground. But this was something else. Something that didn't follow rules. Maybe we should just give it a minute," someone suggested from the back. A woman crossed herself. Another clasped her hands together, murmuring a prayer. The church no longer felt like a place of farewell. It felt like a holding room, suspended between two realities. Max shifted his weight slightly, angling his body more squarely, in front of the coffin. His eyes tracked every movement in the room, alert but calm. He wasn't asking permission. He was enforcing a boundary. Emily stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Max," she said softly, testing the word. "What are you doing?" Max glanced at her for a brief second, just long enough for her to see it again. That same urgency, that same certainty. Then his gaze snapped back to the coffin. Her throat tightened. She turned toward the small group of people nearest her. "He's never done this," she said. "Not once. He's trained. He listens." "Dogs act strange around death," Frank said automatically. But the words felt hollow now. He rubbed his palms together, grounding himself. "We're reading too much into it." A man near the aisle shook his head. "I've hunted dogs my whole life," he said. "That ain't grief." The funeral director checked his watch again. Time mattered, especially when resources were thin. Storage fees, transport costs, liability. These were things families like the Brookses couldn't afford to question. "Ma'am," he said again, firmer now, "we need to proceed." Max barked, not loud, not frantic. One bark, sharp, final. The sound cut clean through the room. Emily felt something snap inside her. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. She stepped forward until she stood beside Max, between him and the people trying to move past him. "We're not proceeding," she said. Frank stared at her. "Emily." "No," she interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "Not yet." The room buzzed with low voices now, tension spreading like static. Someone moved toward the exit. Another leaned closer, eyes fixed on the coffin, as if expecting it to move on its own. Max's breathing changed again. Slow, controlled. His ears twitched, catching something no one else could. He lowered his head slightly, pressing closer to the wood, guarding it with his entire body. Emily followed his gaze. A thought pushed its way into her mind, unwelcome and terrifying. What if this wasn't about death at all? What if this was about something unfinished? She knelt slowly beside Max, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're saying no," she whispered. "Aren't you?" Max didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply stayed. Frank looked at the coffin, then at his daughter, then at the faces around him. Fear, doubt, curiosity all mixing together. The certainty he had carried into that church felt fragile now, like glass under pressure. "Get the doctor," someone said quietly. The funeral director hesitated. "The coroner already signed." "Get him anyway," Frank said suddenly. His voice was rough, stripped of authority and pride. "If there's even a chance." Max shifted slightly, giving Frank just enough space to step closer to the coffin. Frank didn't touch it this time. He didn't need to. The dog standing guard had already made the message clear. Whatever was inside that coffin was not finished. And for the first time since the service began, no one tried to move forward. They stood there, held in place by a dog who refused to step aside, by a moment that demanded to be seen. The barking stopped completely. Not a single sound came from Max now. Not a whine, not a growl, not even the soft huff of his breath. The sudden quiet was so absolute it felt unnatural, like the moment right before a storm breaks. Everyone noticed it at once. Several people shifted, uneasy, as if the room itself had changed temperature. Max lowered himself slowly until his chest touched the floor. Then, with deliberate care, he pressed his ear flat against the lid of the coffin. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The silence that followed was heavier than grief, heavier than fear. It wasn't empty. It was crowded. Crowded with anticipation, with thoughts no one dared to say out loud. The old church creaked softly as the wind pushed against its walls. Somewhere outside, a truck passed on the highway, its sound distant and irrelevant. Inside, time felt suspended. "What's he doing now?" someone whispered. No one answered. Max's body was completely still, as if he'd turned to stone. His eyes were open but unfocused. Time 200 memos. His attention drawn inward, listening. Emily had never seen him like this. Not when fireworks rattled the sky. Not when strangers knocked late at night. This wasn't fear. This was concentration. She took a cautious step forward. Her shoes barely made a sound on the wooden floor. Each movement felt amplified, intrusive. She knelt beside Max, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. "Max," she murmured. Nothing. Frank stood a few feet behind her, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He had stopped trying to explain things away. The explanations had all gone thin. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "This isn't right," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The funeral director hovered near the side aisle, face pale, tie loosened. This wasn't in his training. Silence was supposed to be peaceful. This silence felt predatory. Emily hesitated, then reached out and placed her palm gently against the coffin. The wood was cool beneath her skin. For a brief moment, there was nothing. Time 800 mestres. No movement, no vibration, no sign of life. She almost pulled her hand back, embarrassed by her own fear. "You're imagining things," she told herself. "You're exhausted." Then she felt it, so faint it could have been mistaken for her own pulse. A barely there tremor beneath her palm, like something shifting far away. Her heart slammed violently against her ribs. She froze. Max made a soft sound then. Not a bark, not a whine. A breathy exhale, as if confirming something he already knew. Emily's voice came out shaky. "Dad, come here." Frank stepped forward reluctantly. He knelt beside her, his movements stiff, and placed his hand next to hers on the lid. His brows knit together. For a long second, his face showed nothing. Then, his eyes widened. He pulled his hand back sharply. "I felt that," he said, his voice hoarse. A low murmur spread through the church. "You felt what? Did it move? That's not possible." The funeral director shook his head, forcing a thin smile. There can be residual effects," he said, words tumbling too quickly. "Temperature changes, pressure. It doesn't mean—" Max lifted his head suddenly. His ears pricked forward. His body tensed. Then he pressed his ear back against the coffin again, harder this time, as if trying to hear through layers of distance and doubt. Emily leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching the wood. She held her breath, afraid even the sound of it might interfere. And then, there it was. A sound. Not loud. Not clear. A dull, muted thump from inside the coffin, like a knock heard through water. Emily gasped and staggered back, one hand flying to her mouth. Someone screamed. Another person stumbled toward the pews, shaking their head violently. "That didn't come from us," a man said, panic rising in his voice. Frank's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His entire world, rules, certainty, finality, collapsed inward on itself. Max barked once, sharp, triumphant. "Rate slow." The room erupted into chaos. Voices overlapping, chairs scraping, prayers shouted and whispered at the same time. Some people backed away from the coffin as if it might explode. Others rushed closer, desperate to see, to know. The funeral director backed up 2 steps, hands raised. "We need to stop," he said. "We need to call someone, right now." Emily's legs shook so badly she thought she might collapse. She pressed both hands to the coffin again, tears streaming down her face now. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you can hear me, please." Another sound answered her, this time unmistakable. A faint knock. Slow, weak, but real. Max stood up straight, barking again, louder now, urgency flooding back into his voice. He paced once and then returned to the front of the coffin, staring at it with unblinking focus. The silence shattered completely. There was no denying it anymore. Something, or someone, was alive inside that coffin, and every second they hesitated now carried a cost no one in that room could afford to pay. The church no longer felt like a place of farewell. It felt like a room holding its breath. After the second knock came from inside the coffin, no one spoke for several long seconds. The sound had been too real, too deliberate to explain away. It hadn't echoed like a trick of wood or settled like imagination. It had landed, solid and undeniable. Emily stood frozen, both hands pressed against the edge of the coffin, her chest rising and falling too fast. Her ears rang as if her body were trying to reject what it had just heard. She turned slowly, looking at the faces around her, searching for someone, anyone, to tell her she was wrong. No one did. Frank backed away a step, shaking his head. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice wavered. "People don't just—" He stopped mid-sentence, unable to finish the thought. Max stood rigid at the front of the coffin, tail straight, eyes fixed. His barking had stopped again, replaced by something quieter, but more commanding. He was waiting. The funeral director wiped his hands on his suit jacket, breathing shallowly. "There are rare cases," he began, choosing his words carefully, the way professionals do when they're standing on ground that's starting to crack. "Muscle contractions, residual nerve activity." Emily rounded on him. "You heard it," she said. "That wasn't a muscle." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. "Sounded like knocking to me." "My cousin's a nurse, that ain't normal." "Lord have mercy." The director swallowed. "We need to slow down," he insisted. "This is serious. We could be talking about liability, about legal exposure." Liability. Legal exposure. Emily laughed once, sharp, broken. "We couldn't afford health insurance," she said. "You think we're worried about legal exposure?" The words hung heavy. Daniel had worked his whole life without a safety net. No life insurance policy. No emergency savings. Just a body that finally failed him. And a system, time 500 pelhams, that moved on without waiting. Frank rubbed his face, his hands trembling now. "Call the coroner," he said quietly. "Right now." The director hesitated. He already signed off. "Call him anyway," Frank snapped, louder than he meant to. "If there's even a chance." Someone pulled out a phone. Another followed. The sound of hurried dialing filled the church, replacing hymns with ringing lines and whispered explanations. Max suddenly moved, pacing once along the length of the coffin, before stopping again at the front. He let out a short, sharp bark, one that cut through the noise like a warning bell. Emily dropped to her knees beside him. "We're trying," she whispered. "Just hold on." Her words surprised her. Hold on. She hadn't said that since the hospital, since the doctor had looked at her with practiced sympathy and talked about procedures and paperwork and next steps. She hadn't said it because she'd been told there was nothing left to hold on to. Now, doubt clawed its way, time 500 mouse song, into her chest, terrifying and undeniable. Frank stared at the coffin, memories crashing in. Daniel as a kid, refusing to quit Little League even when he was the smallest one on the field. Daniel as a teenager, working double shifts to help pay bills. He'd always been stubborn, always slow to give up. "What if," Frank began, then stopped. The thought felt dangerous. Hope always did. The phone call ended abruptly. A man near the aisle looked up, pale. "He's on his way," he said. "Said he'd be here in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. The number landed like a threat. Max barked again, louder this time, pacing in tight circles before returning to his post. His nails clicked against the wood floor, each sound sharp, impatient. "He doesn't think we have 10 minutes, Emily said. No one argued. A woman crossed herself again. A man wiped his eyes, staring at the coffin like it might explode. The church felt smaller now, walls pressing inward as doubt spread through the room. The funeral director backed away, his authority dissolving. "If this turns into a medical emergency," he said weakly, "we'll need emergency medical care. An ambulance." "Then call one," Emily said. "Now." He hesitated only a second before nodding. Max stopped pacing and stood perfectly still again, his entire body angled toward the coffin. He let out a low, urgent sound, not meant for human ears, but they heard it anyway. The doubt had taken hold. Not gentle doubt, not philosophical doubt, the kind that rattles your bones and forces you to question everything you were ready to accept, the kind that makes paperwork feel flimsy and time feel cruel. Frank placed a hand on the coffin again, this time without hesitation. "Hang on, son," he whispered. "Just hang on." Inside that box, something answered faintly. Not another knock. Something weaker. Breath. Fear didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, filling the spaces where certainty used to live. After the vibration faded, no one rushed forward immediately. Hands that had been hovering near the coffin pulled back. People exchanged looks heavy with dread, as if each face were asking the same unspoken question. What if this goes wrong? Emily felt it tightening around her chest. The fear of being wrong, of making the worst mistake of her life in front of everyone who would remember it forever. Her knees trembled, but she stayed where she was, one hand still pressed to the wood, as if letting go might seal Daniel's fate. Frank stood slowly, rubbing his palms against his jeans, like he was trying to wake himself up. His thoughts raced in directions he'd avoided his entire life. What if we open it and there's nothing there? What if this destroys what little dignity he has left? Fear didn't care about dignity. Fear cared about consequences. The funeral director stepped back again, shaking his head. This is getting out of control. Time 200, he said, voice tight. If we open that coffin and something happens, if he doesn't make it, every one of us could be blamed. Blamed for what? Emily shot back. Trying? No one answered her. Max paced again, faster now, his movements sharp and restless. He let out a series of short, urgent barks, each one slicing through the silence. His ears flicked constantly, reacting to sounds no one else could hear, or maybe sounds they were too afraid to acknowledge. A woman near the aisle hugged her coat tighter around herself. I don't like this, she whispered. This feels wrong. It already is wrong, Frank said suddenly. His voice surprised even him. Low, rough, stripped of hesitation. What's wrong is standing here arguing while my son's running out of air. The word air landed hard. Emily felt her throat close. She imagined Daniel inside that box. Darkness pressing in, lungs burning, consciousness flickering like a dying light. The image was unbearable. She shook her head, time 600 masum, tears streaking down her face. We don't have life insurance, she said quietly. If he dies because we waited, there won't be anything left of us. Fear shifted shape then. It wasn't just about doing the wrong thing anymore. It was about doing nothing. The sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance, farther than Emily had hoped. She clutched Max's collar as he surged forward again, his barking louder now, frantic but focused. He's scared, someone said. No, Frank replied. He's telling us something. Max stopped abruptly and stared straight at Emily, eyes wide, almost pleading. He barked once, long and sharp, then turned and faced the coffin again. Emily wiped her face with trembling hands and stood. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she felt. I'm not waiting anymore. The funeral director's eyes widened. Ma'am, I'm his wife, she said, and I'm saying we open it. A stunned silence followed. Frank moved to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. I'm with you, he said. His fear was still there, heavy and undeniable, but it no longer ruled him. A man from the back stepped forward hesitantly. If you need help, he said, I'll help. Another joined him, then another. Fear spread, but so did resolve. Max barked again, then fell silent, standing perfectly still as if bracing for what came next. His tail was rigid, his body taut, eyes locked on the lid. Emily reached for the edge of the coffin, fingers brushing the smooth wood. It felt colder now than before. She hesitated, heart pounding so hard she thought she might pass out. What if we're too late? Someone whispered. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second. Then, at least he won't be alone, she thought. She nodded to the men beside her. On 3, she said. The sirens outside grew louder, closer, but still not close enough. "One," she whispered. Max's ears twitched. "Two." The vibration didn't come again. Fear surged, sharp and suffocating. "Three." Hands tightened around the edges of the coffin. Before they could lift, a sudden, unmistakable sound erupted from inside. A knock, stronger than before, clear, deliberate. Gasps filled the room. Someone cried out. Frank stumbled back, his face ashen. Max barked wildly now, a sound of urgency and triumph colliding. He paced once, twice, then returned to his spot, staring at the coffin like a soldier awaiting orders. Emily's legs nearly gave out. "He's alive," she whispered. "He's really alive." Fear exploded into chaos. There was no more debate, no more hesitation. Whatever waited inside that coffin could not wait another second. The knock didn't fade. It lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable, as if the sound itself refused to be ignored. For a moment, no one moved. Faces were frozen in shock, mouths slightly open, eyes locked on the coffin as if it might knock again on its own. The church, once filled with quiet acceptance, now buzzed with raw panic. Fear had crossed a line. There was no going back. Emily's hands trembled so badly, she had to grip the edge of the coffin to steady herself. Her legs felt weak, but her mind was suddenly sharp, painfully clear. That was him. There was no doubt left, no room for explanations or paperwork or polite hesitation. Frank staggered backward until he hit a pew, catching himself with one hand. His chest heaved as if he'd been punched. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, I heard it." Max barked again. Loud, rapid, relentless. Not grief, not confusion. This was command. His paws scraped the floor as he paced, then snapped back to the front of the coffin. Time 2000 Mo, standing guard with renewed urgency. "He's suffocating," Emily said, the words ripping out of her. "We don't have time." The funeral director raised both hands, his face pale. "Listen to me," he said quickly. "Once that coffin is opened, this becomes a medical emergency. There are risks, serious risks. We don't know his condition, brain injury, oxygen deprivation. If something happens..." "Something is happening," Frank cut in, his voice hoarse. "Right now." The sirens outside grew louder, echoing faintly through the hills. Still too far, still not enough. A man near the aisle swallowed hard. "If we open it," he said, "we better be ready." "We are ready," Emily said. She wiped her face with her sleeve, smearing tears she didn't have time for. "Ready or not?" She looked down at Max. He had gone still again, eyes burning bright, chest rising and falling fast. She had never trusted anyone or anything more in her life. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, Max." She placed both hands firmly on the lid. The wood felt heavier now, as if the truth inside it carried weight of its own. The men beside her mirrored her movement, hands braced, knuckles whitening. "On three," Frank said, stepping forward despite his shaking knees. Max barked sharply, as if counting with them. 1. The coffin creaked faintly as pressure shifted. 2. Another knock came from inside, weak, frantic, a sound born of desperation. Emily choked back a sob. "Daniel, we're here," she cried. "Just hang on." 3. They lifted. The lid rose slowly, inch by inch, every second stretching like a lifetime. Cold air rushed in as the seal broke, carrying a faint, sour scent that made several people gag. Then they saw him. Daniel lay inside, his skin pale, lips tinged blue, chest barely moving. His eyes fluttered weakly beneath half-closed lids, unfocused, but alive. Emily screamed his name and collapsed forward, hands shaking as she touched his face. His skin was cold, but not lifeless. "He's breathing!" someone shouted. "Barely, but he's breathing!" Chaos erupted. Phones were raised. People shouted for towels, for air, for anything that might help. The funeral director backed away in horror, hands trembling as he muttered, "This can't be happening." Max leapt forward, barking wildly now, licking Daniel's face, whining with desperate relief. His tail thrashed as if trying to will life back into the man he loved. Daniel's fingers twitched. Emily gasped. "Did you see that?" Frank dropped to his knees, sobbing openly now, gripping the edge of the coffin like it was the only thing holding him upright. "Stay with us, son," he begged. "Please stay." The sirens outside screamed closer now. Real, immediate. Doors were thrown open as cold air rushed into the church. "They're here!" someone shouted. Emily pressed her forehead to Daniel's, her voice breaking. "You scared me," she whispered. "Don't you ever do that again." Daniel didn't answer, but his chest rose again. Weak, uneven, real. Max stepped back just enough to give them space, then sat down beside the coffin, chest heaving, eyes never leaving Daniel's face. His job wasn't finished, but he had done what no one else could. The knock from inside the coffin had shattered certainty, fear, and rules all at once. What lay ahead was unknown. Emergency surgery, hospital bills, insurance questions, long nights of waiting. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was this. They had opened the coffin in time. The rules collapsed the moment the coffin opened. Paramedics rushed in through the church doors, boots echoing against the wooden floor as they took in the scene. An open casket. A man barely breathing. A room full of shaken witnesses. Training snapped them into motion. Oxygen tank. Bag valve mask. Monitors unpacked with practiced speed. "Sir, can you hear me?" one paramedic asked, leaning close to Daniel's face. Daniel didn't answer, but his chest fluttered again, shallow and uneven. "That's spontaneous breathing," the medic said, urgency sharpening his voice. "We've got a pulse, weak but present." Emily pressed herself against the side of the coffin, tears streaming freely now, her hands shaking as she tried not to get in the way. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't stop." Frank hovered nearby, useless and terrified, watching professionals do what he couldn't. His mind raced through a lifetime of trust in systems, procedures, signatures, authority. All of it felt paper-thin now. One wrong assumption, one rushed decision, and his son would have been buried alive. The funeral director stood off to the side, pale and silent, his world unraveling. Years of compliance, contracts, and careful adherence to law had never prepared him for this. Breaking protocol had saved a life. Following it would have ended one. "We need to move him now," the lead paramedic said. "He's hypoxic. Oxygen deprivation. Every second counts." They carefully lifted Daniel from the coffin, securing his neck and airway, placing him onto a stretcher. His body felt fragile, as if it might disappear if handled too roughly. The monitors beeped, a thin, rhythmic sound that cut through the chaos like hope. Max paced anxiously, whining, nails clicking sharply against the floor. When the stretcher rolled past him, he tried to follow, tail wagging in short, frantic bursts. A paramedic gently blocked him. "Easy, buddy," the man said softly. "We've got him." Max didn't understand the words, but he understood the movement. "Time 500 palms." He stayed close, pressing against Emily's leg as they pushed Daniel toward the door. Outside, the winter air hit them hard. The ambulance lights flashed red and blue against the gray sky, reflecting off wet pavement. Neighbors stood frozen on the sidewalk, stunned by what they were witnessing. A funeral turning into a rescue. As they loaded Daniel into the ambulance, a paramedic turned to Emily. "We're taking him to the county hospital," he said. "He'll need intensive care. This is serious." Emily nodded numbly. "Whatever he needs," she said. "We'll figure it out." Frank caught the words she didn't say. "We don't have insurance. We don't know how we'll pay." Anger surged. Not at the medics, not at Emily, but at a world where saving a life came with a price tag that could crush a family already on its knees. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Max lunged forward, barking sharply as the ambulance began to pull away. Emily dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him, as if anchoring them both to the ground. "It's okay," she whispered into his fur. "You did it. You saved him." Max whined softly, eyes fixed on the departing ambulance until it disappeared around the bend. Only then did he sit, exhausted, chest rising and falling heavily. Inside the church, silence returned. But it was different now. Charged, heavy with realization. People spoke in low voices, disbelief mixing with awe. "That dog knew. We almost buried him. God help us." Frank stood alone near the open coffin, staring at the empty space where his son had been. His hands shook as he rested them on the wood. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I trusted the rules instead of my own blood." The funeral director approached cautiously. I'll make calls," he said, voice hollow. "There will be reports, investigations." Frank nodded. "Do what you have to do." Outside, sirens faded into the distance, carrying Daniel toward a future that had almost been erased. The road ahead would be brutal. ICU machines, medical bills, insurance appeals, questions no one wanted to answer. But there was still a road. Emily stood slowly, wiping her face, and looked back at the church one last time. "We broke every rule today," she said. Frank met her gaze. "Good," he replied. "Some rules aren't worth keeping." Max stood between them, steady and quiet now, his work done for the moment. The coffin remained open, an empty reminder of how close they had come to saying goodbye too soon. The hospital corridors were colder than the church had been. Emily felt it the moment the automatic doors slid shut behind them, sealing out the winter air and replacing it with the sharp smell of disinfectant and humming machines. Fluorescent lights washed everything in a pale glow that made faces look tired and fragile. The ambulance stretcher rolled fast, wheels rattling softly as nurses cleared the way. "Low oxygen saturation," a paramedic reported. "Unknown downtime. Possible hypoxic injury." Emily barely understood the words, but she understood the tone. Urgent, careful, uncertain. She walked beside the stretcher until a nurse gently blocked her path. "We need space now, ma'am." Her legs felt weak as she stopped. Frank caught her arm just in time, guiding her to a row of plastic chairs against the wall. Max sat at her feet, pressed close, his body warm and steady against her shaking legs. The ER doors swung shut. Silence rushed in behind them. For the first time since the coffin opened, there was nothing to do, no decision to make, no rule to break. Just waiting, raw and exposed. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time lost its shape. Emily stared at the floor, replaying everything in her mind. The knock, the vibration, the sound of Daniel breathing for the first time after they'd thought he was gone. Her chest tightened painfully. Frank sat rigid beside her, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He hadn't said much since the ambulance left. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I signed the paperwork," he said. "I told them to proceed. I didn't question it." Emily looked at him, surprised by the crack in his voice. "We all believed it," she said quietly. He shook his head. "I shouldn't have. I taught him better than that." Max lifted his head at the sound of Frank's voice, ears twitching. He looked toward the ER doors, then back at Emily, then at Frank, checking, waiting. A doctor emerged at last, pushing the doors open with his shoulder. He was middle-aged, his face drawn with concentration rather than panic. "Time 5,000 machapta." Emily stood so fast the chair tipped backward. "Mrs. Brooks?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely holding together. "Is he?" "He's alive," the doctor said calmly. "And stable, for now." Emily's knees nearly buckled. Frank let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding since the church. "But," the doctor continued, holding up a hand, "we need to be clear about what happened." They followed him into a small consultation room. Max tried to come with them, but a nurse gently blocked him. "Just a moment, buddy." Max whined softly, but sat, eyes locked on the door. The doctor folded his hands. Your husband experienced a cardiac event at the job site, he explained. His heart restarted briefly, then stopped again. It appears he entered a state called suspended animation, extremely rare. His vital signs were so faint they were missed. Emily felt sick. So, he was alive the whole time? Barely, the doctor said honestly. But yes, had the coffin remained sealed much longer, there would have been no chance. Frank closed his eyes, pain cutting deep across his face. There will be questions, the doctor continued. Reviews. But right now, our priority is recovery. He's on life support. The next 24 hours are critical. Emily nodded numbly. What about costs? The doctor hesitated. The hospital has financial assistance programs. We'll connect you with a counselor. Focus on him. Focus on him. When they were finally allowed into the ICU, Emily's breath caught at the sight of Daniel. Tubes, wires, machines softly beeping. His chest rose and fell with mechanical rhythm. Alive, but fragile. Max was allowed in briefly. The moment he saw Daniel, his tail wagged weakly, and he let out a low, relieved sound. He stepped closer, nose twitching, then gently rested his head against the edge of the bed. Daniel's fingers twitched. Emily gasped softly. Did you see that? The nurse smiled. He's responding. Max stayed there, unmoving, eyes fixed on Daniel's face as if guarding him one last time. The truth had finally surfaced. Not just that Daniel was alive, but that the world had nearly failed him. Paperwork, assumptions, a system that moved too fast for those without protection, like health insurance or savings. Only instinct had slowed it down. Only a dog had refused to let go. Emily reached for Daniel's hand, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. You're not done, she whispered. Not yet. Max lifted his head, eyes calm now. For the first time since the funeral, the truth was clear. Daniel had been saved, not by rules, not by authority, but by loyalty that refused to accept an ending. Night fell hard over the hospital, pressing its weight against the windows like a second ceiling. The ICU never truly slept, but the hours after midnight carried a different tension. Quieter, sharper, every sound amplified. Machines hummed. Monitors beeped in steady patterns that felt both comforting and terrifying. Each rise and fall of Daniel's chest was a negotiation with time. Emily sat beside the bed, her coat folded under her arm, forgotten. She had memorized the rhythm of the monitor, the soft click of the ventilator, the way the light above Daniel's face cast shadows that made him look older than 42. She watched for every sign, a twitch, a breath that came a fraction stronger than the one before. Frank paced the narrow strip of floor near the door. He stopped whenever a nurse passed, as if expecting news to arrive with their footsteps. His mind ran ahead to things he'd never wanted to consider. ICU stays, life insurance he'd never pushed Daniel to buy, the cost of emergency, medical care that could bury a family already struggling. The numbers frightened him more than the machines did. Max lay curled near the foot of the bed, head on his paws, eyes open. He slept in short, shallow stretches, waking whenever a sound changed. A nurse had tried to move him earlier, gently, apologetically. Max had risen, quiet and unyielding, placing himself back where he could see Daniel's face. The nurse had nodded and left him there. "He's guarding," she'd whispered to Emily. "I've seen this before." Hours passed. The monitor dipped once, just a hair, and Emily's breath caught so hard it hurt. A nurse adjusted a setting, calm and precise. The line steadied again. Emily let the air leave her lungs in a long, silent rush. "Next few hours are critical," the doctor had said. "We're racing swelling, oxygen deprivation, and the clock." Racing. The word felt too gentle for what was happening. At 2 a.m, Daniel's heart rate fluttered. The monitor's beeps quickened, sharp and insistent. A nurse moved faster now, calling for backup. Another doctor stepped in, eyes narrowing as he scanned the numbers. Emily stood so abruptly, her chair scraped loudly. "What's happening?" "Arrhythmia," the doctor said, without looking up. "We're correcting it." Frank grabbed Emily's arm, grounding her. She could feel his hand shaking. Max rose to his feet, ears forward, body tense. He let out a low sound, soft, controlled, as if urging the room itself to stay steady. His tail barely moved. His eyes never left Daniel. "Sir," a nurse said gently, "we need space." Frank nodded and pulled Emily back a step, though every instinct screamed at her to move closer. She pressed her palms together, whispering words she didn't remember learning. The machine settled. The beeping returned to its measured pace. Emily sagged against the wall, tears finally spilling without restraint. Frank bowed his head, breathing through clenched teeth. The doctor adjusted a line and exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said. "We're okay. For now." For now. The race didn't stop. It only shifted lanes. Near dawn, the sky outside the window lightened from black to bruised blue. Snow drifted down in lazy spirals, quiet and indifferent. The hospital seemed suspended, between night and morning, between loss and the fragile promise of survival. A nurse brought coffee. Emily wrapped her hands around the cup without tasting it. "Will he wake up?" The nurse chose her words carefully. "We're looking for sons. Small ones count." As if summoned by the word small, Daniel's fingers moved. Not much, not dramatic. A slight curl, then stillness. Emily's breath hitched. "Did you?" "Yes," the nurse said, smiling. "I saw it." Max lifted his head at once, rising and stepping closer. He sniffed the air near Daniel's hand, then settled again, placing his chin on the mattress edge. His tail thumped once, just once. The doctor returned with the morning team. Charts were reviewed, decisions made, more time bought. "We're not out of the woods," he said plainly. "But he's fighting." Frank nodded. He always did. As the sun finally cleared the hills, light spilled into the room, soft and tentative. Emily leaned close and spoke quietly, as if Daniel could hear every word. She talked about ordinary things. Coffee gone cold, the truck that needed fixing, Max stealing socks again. She talked like tomorrow was already planned. Max stayed, unwavering. This was the desperate race no one had expected to run. Not against death alone, but against seconds. Against systems that moved too fast. Against the quiet costs of being unprotected. It wasn't over. It might never be easy. But as Daniel's chest rose and fell, steady enough to count, the race found a fragile rhythm, and for the first time since the church, hope felt less like a mistake. Morning settled into the ICU like a fragile truce. Sunlight crept through the narrow window, pale and cautious, touching the machines before it reached Daniel's face. The night team gave way to the day shift, voices lower, movements efficient. Clipboards changed hands. Numbers were reviewed. Prognoses were offered in careful tones that promised nothing. Emily sat very still, afraid that even shifting her weight might tip the balance. She had learned the language of the room now. The difference between a steady beep and a warning. The pause that meant a nurse was thinking. The look that meant a doctor was weighing risk. This place lived in margins, in percentages, in maybes. Frank stood at the window, hands folded behind his back, staring at the parking lot below. Cars came and went, ordinary lives moving on while his hovered in suspension. He thought about the call he would have to make to Daniel's employer, about disability forms, about life insurance he'd never insisted on. The cost of survival loomed as heavily as the fear of losing him. Rate slow. Emergency medical care saved lives, but it also changed them. Max lay on the floor near the bed, head lifted, eyes tracking every movement. He hadn't barked since the ambulance doors closed the night before. His work here was quieter now, watching, waiting, holding the line. The doctor returned mid-morning with a small team. He spoke plainly. "We're reducing sedation," he said. "We want to see how he responds. There are risks, confusion, agitation, but we need information." Emily nodded, heart thudding. "Will he know us?" "Maybe not right away," the doctor said, "but signs of awareness matter." The ventilator softened its rhythm. The room seemed to lean in. Minutes passed. Daniel's brow tightened, a faint crease forming. His breathing shifted, uneven for a moment, then steadied. Emily's hands trembled in her lap. "Daniel," she said softly. "It's Emily. I'm here." No response. Max rose slowly and stepped forward, placing his chin, times 600 on the mattress edge. He made a low, gentle sound. Not a bark, not a whine. Something intimate, familiar. Daniel's fingers moved. Not the twitch from before. This time they curled, weakly, deliberately, around the sheet. Emily gasped. He's grabbing." The nurse smiled. "That's purposeful movement." The doctor nodded, cautious but encouraged. "Daniel," he said louder, Can you hear me? Daniel's eyelids fluttered. His mouth opened slightly, soundless. Confusion crossed his face like a shadow passing over water. Emily fought the urge to cry out. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're in the hospital. We're here." The room held its breath. Then Daniel exhaled, a ragged human sound that cut through the machines. His eyes opened a fraction, unfocused, drifting. They found Max first. His fingers tightened. Max's tail thumped once against the floor. "Good," the doctor said quietly. "That's good." Relief didn't rush in all at once. It came in waves, interrupted by warnings. The doctor explained the road ahead: monitoring for brain injury, respiratory therapy, the possibility of surgery, the reality of a long recovery. Words like rehabilitation and outpatient care hovered, followed by practical considerations: coverage, financial assistance, appeals. Emily nodded through it all, anchoring herself to the simple truth in front of her. Daniel was here. He had crossed back. Frank stepped closer, voice rough.